Very excited to have Michael Maltzan here for this evening's lecture. I just wanted to start by welcoming everyone and thanking Liam O'Brien, who curated this lecture series called Architecture and Its Orbits. Really thinking through whether at this moment the discipline has a center of gravity, or in fact there are many peripheral movements and collisions actually happening to create some illusion of a center of gravity. So tonight I asked if Hashim would give the introduction, because I heard that Hashim was roommates with Michael Maltzan back in architecture school. And I was trying to dig deep to get some dirt on that period of time, but I couldn't find anything. So hopefully Hashim will share. Thanks.
As you all know, what happens in graduate school stays in graduate school. Thank you very much for joining, but I wanted you actually, before you sat down, to maybe stand up again so that we can all recognize you for the great award that you received at the new generation leader award from architecture. So please, and Sheila got it last year, so did they applaud you last year?
No, they didn't.
Okay, and we applaud you. This is really an honor for the profession, but also for our school. So thank you very much. Our guest tonight is Michael Maltzan. Michael received a Master of Architecture degree with distinction from Harvard University, and he has a Bachelor of Fine Arts and Bachelor of Architecture from Rhode Island School of Design, where he also received the Henry Adams AIA Gold Medal. After moving to Los Angeles in 1989, Michael worked for Frank Gehry, and then he founded Michael Maltzan Architecture, Inc. in 1995. His designs have been published and exhibited internationally, and he regularly teaches and lectures at architecture schools around the world. Michael is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and the recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award. Megan has kindly asked me to introduce Michael because of the personal and long connection I have with him, having been my first TA at RISD, my roommate at Harvard, someone whose work I admire and I teach in my classes. We just spoke about your work on Wednesday. And most importantly, the one who married my good friend Amy Murphy and took her all the way to LA. That I still hold against both. The move to LA was a surprising one, but actually a very powerful first step in an amazing career that unfolded since then, and that still draws from the energy of the city, but gives it back much more. There are very few architects today who are able to work effectively with the same powerful hand at such a vast range of scales. Some are good at small, and when they get big, they treat their big as small. Michael treats his big as big and small as small, but his hand is evenly strong at both. LA gives him this variegated ground for the scalar juxtapositions that he masters very well. There are also very few who are able to assimilate into their work a complexity of cultural inputs, from sculpture, painting, but also the practices of walking, driving, seeing, and being seen. And I know there's a lot of that going on in LA. While asserting the primacy of architecture as a framework that holds all this together, not in a hegemonic way, but respectfully and playfully engaging. You will see that. And the drivers and surfers that are part of that culture see the world differently, and Michael's buildings wink right back at them. There are also very few architects who are able to find room and expression for civicness in all their projects. The way he embraces and highlights and lets the public realm cut through his ground floors and sometimes go higher, and please keep an eye on his beautiful sections. And to find possibilities of civic engagement in a parking ramp or a fence around a schoolyard are always very unexpected and invariably stunning. So for all of this great work, we forgive you the move to LA and welcome you back to MIT.
Thank you, Hashim. I promise all of our secrets are safe. The idea of this lecture series was a very compelling one to me, the idea of asking the question in architecture of where centers are, if there are centers anymore. To a certain extent, my move to Los Angeles was to get away from a center at that time and to find a city in which the idea of center was very much a challenged one. And I would certainly argue that Los Angeles on the question of center is an ongoing discussion, ongoing battle. That idea of the range of architectural practice continues to be of significant interest, a real driver in my work. In fact, I think for contemporary practice, I'd say I'm most interested right now in range. That architecture, while it possesses incredible, extraordinary capacities towards specialized knowledge and abilities, in many ways, my interest is in architecture's ability as a discipline, as much as a practice, to expand its context, its building types, the forms of its work. Partially, this has been in response to the fact that the range of our work and the types of projects has been extremely varied. And some of that, I think, is luck. But also some of that is because we have actively tried to look for projects that are not necessarily similar to the other projects that we're doing, to continue to challenge the practice in a way to take on an increasingly complex relationship to social, political, and physical context, which especially working at least partially in Los Angeles, it has been a major driver. I've come to believe that architecture's ability to move beyond the singular building to the scale of master plan, to the scale of landscape, and in some ways to the scale of the social and political engagement of the discipline itself, that in that move, architecture continues to have a very real, challenging, productive and optimistic role in culture today. In that sense, I would say that while I'm still very much interested in contemporary form in terms of what we do, I think I'm even more interested right now in the form of contemporary practice, in its elasticity. We've been working over the past number of years with a group called the Skid Row Housing Trust, building permanent supportive housing for mostly individuals who are formerly homeless. In an area of the city that's in great transition, the Skid Row district of Los Angeles, which is undergoing extraordinary pressure from almost every direction. My interest in housing in many ways goes back to my time as a student. Housing was always a significant studio that we took, but even more so, it was that in that typology, modernism, which was something I was very much interested in, had seen as a type the ability to ask many diverse, many complex questions that went beyond form and included questions of social, economic, political engagements. Those mechanisms, which are very much the same types of mechanism that guide the city itself, thinking about collective and community living in the city, makes housing, I think, even more an important typology today. We weren't, for many years, able to get housing. There wasn't a lot of housing for architects to do in Los Angeles, a city that has primarily been marked by, and certainly its identity is a city of the single family residence sprawling endlessly to the horizon. But increasingly, as density has become more and more a factor in the city, housing has started to become something that is a real part of the conversation about how cities are, this city is being built, Los Angeles is being built. I'm not going to show all of the projects. We've done 4 projects. We're about to finish the 4th project with the Skid Row Housing Trust. Just the 2 second and third projects. But the second project, Carver Apartments, which you see here, was built a little bit off of the immediate center of Skid Row. And there was a reason for that, driving that decision by the trust. And that was to try to take a community which has been largely anonymous to the broader urban community and make it that much more visible to the city as a whole. And if you go back to this image just for a second, this is the building here. This is the 10 freeway going out to the Pacific Ocean. In close proximity to LA Live and Staples Center, which is where the Lakers play, a place that a great deal of the city comes by all of the time. That proximity to the highway, about 30 feet away, was seen as an incredible attribute as opposed to a deficit, because in Los Angeles, our public space is very often the highway itself. Putting the building in that kind of proximity to the highway meant that immediately you started to create at least a tacit relationship between a community that is largely unseen and the public street of Los Angeles. That proximity to the highway, though, also produced a great challenge, and that was primarily the acoustics on the site, which were so intense that to put housing that close to the highway meant very particular planning for the building. To a certain extent, the shaping of the building, this round form, came from the reality of its proximity to the highway. It became clear with us working with the acoustician that every foot that we could get away from the highway meant some drop in the decibel level of the sound, the noise that we had to deal with. And that was important because it meant that the construction could get a little bit lighter, which meant it was more affordable. But there was another benefit to this proximity, which had to do with the, and I won't do this too many times too, but had to do with the proximity visually, as I mentioned, to the highway and the shaping of the building in an almost, certainly a recognizable, if not iconic form on the highway, one that seemed to relate to that sense of movement and motion of the highway, began to create not only a greater identity for the building, but potentially in the very form of the building, began to start to create a tacit conversation between those whizzing by in the car and those people inside the building. I'm very interested in the way infrastructure in the city plays a role, or how its role continues to evolve in a city like Los Angeles. You could, I think, say that infrastructure in cities like Los Angeles, which are very much infrastructurally marked cities, that the infrastructure has tended to do only one thing. It's had really only one responsibility, getting a car from one place to another, of creating some kind of access. But that monoculture of use, I think, needs to change. I think it needs to transform, to take on more responsibilities given the scale of resources that we put into infrastructure, the scale of literally just the physical impact and footprint that it has on a city. And even though this project was separated from the highway, I began to think, at least maybe even fantasize, that this building, housing, was somehow connected to the highway. It was a bit of an experiment to see if parts of the building couldn't at least begin to insinuate the idea that there was a more continuous relationship between the underneath and underused space of the highway with the entire ground floor of the building. The plan of the building is set up so that there are a series of perspective skewers that run through the building, connecting different parts of the site. And here you can very much see it in the plan. In a ground floor that is very different than the upper floor of the drum of the rest of the apartment building, but one that takes its form very much from these connective views, as if the views through under the highway start to shoot through that ground floor concrete base of the building. As you start to move up into the building, it takes the shape of its more visible form up above. All of the apartments, 89 units, are exactly the same. One slice of this serrated pie. They're all studio apartments with kitchens and small kitchenette on the inside of the courtyard, bathroom, and then studio apartment facing to the outside. One of the small but consequential inventions in these buildings is that in each of the buildings we've moved from a double-loaded corridor, the typical apartment floor plan where there are apartments on both sides and a corridor in the middle. The problem with this, one of the challenges for this community is that many of the people who have been chronically homeless over many, many years have started to create almost psychological shells around themselves. It's a cruel irony that they've been in public space for so long that the only way of combating that is to create intensely private lives. And in the old model, people would come in the elevator, go up, down the corridor, into their apartment, and you'd never see them again. What we've done in most of these buildings is to crack that open, creating a single-loaded corridor around some kind of a semi-public courtyard. So every time somebody comes to and from their apartment, in a sense, they are navigating a semi-public space, more of a communal space. And while I don't believe that architecture in and of itself changes this deep social dynamic, I think it is one of the ways through planning, that strategic planning, that architecture can play maybe even a more therapeutic role in that loosening up that equation. That inside courtyard space is very much the social heart of the building. At the ground level, there are a series of large stairs that become almost an amphitheater for the community. They do community meetings, they do performances, bands play here. All of the apartments, as I mentioned, ring around this courtyard. It's marked by these long fins that were a very important development in this building because the courtyard is so tight, they act a little bit like blinders on a horse, that they create more opacity to your next door neighbor when you're inside the corridor, but always allow you to see directly across and connect you to the comings and goings of the community around it. They also have the effect of, as they spiral up, starting to reflect the light and the color of the sky at the top of the circular form of the courtyard, and animate that courtyard over the course of the day so that its connection to the outside drifts down by that reflected light and color, changing very much the dynamic of the inside of this space and connecting it to the outside, even though the outside of the building in reality is for a lot of those acoustic reasons very much an internal set of spaces. In the first of these buildings that we did, we took many of the social spaces and placed them on the ground floor. That seemed to make a lot of sense. But what we realized was that one of the problems was that they were more disconnected from the life of the community inside. And instead, in the Carver apartments, we started to distribute them in a spiraling motion up and around the building as if they were points on a three-dimensional extruded compass. With each of these spaces, whether it was the outside lounge, otherwise known as the smoking porch, the TV room and laundry room, which face out towards the highway, that center courtyard space, the community kitchen, which connects to a ground floor outdoor courtyard space, and then the lobby and meeting spaces directly to the street. That each one of them plays a very different role in orienting you away from that internal life of the building back out to the larger community that surrounds the building. And maybe the most important of those spaces is the TV room and the laundry room. It's one of the places that community constantly goes and spends time. And we organized that part of the program at exactly the 30-foot level of the raised highway, as if it's a type of front porch for the building out to the highway. And while in this image it looks like traffic is always moving very quickly in Los Angeles, more often than not, traffic is stopped dead. And it gives that community, in a sense, both of those communities, the opportunity over the course of the day to just see each other. And again, while I think I'm realistic about the change that a building can make and the dynamic of these larger social structures, that fact of starting to create real visual connection between these two distinct communities is something that I think architecture not only can organize, but also has the ability to start making a subtle inflection in the expectations of what a social conversation might be in the city. The third project for the Trust that we completed reasonably recently is the Star Apartments. Each of these buildings is named for an apartment building that was torn down in Los Angeles over the last 20 or 30 years. Star Apartments, which you see here, is moved back onto or within the Skid Row district. And I think it's important to see just the proximity between that district and what people think of as that quintessential skyline of downtown Los Angeles, which is, given the scale of Los Angeles, a bit of a misnomer that there is, in fact, a downtown. But it is a part of the city that is starting to see a more intense and maybe more traditional densification of the city. One of the concerns of the Housing Trust has been that the projects that they've done have been primarily about housing, only about housing, and not as much about a connection urbanistically to the city. This is a district which is fluctuating between having a strong street life and in many ways being a place in which at certain times of the day the city just disappears. The goal for this project is to create really a mixed-use project that has been complicated for the Trust because they take certain subsidies for the rental of these units, and that means that they are also subject to many of the regulations of the Housing Authority. One of those regulations says that if you're doing this type of subsidized housing, that you're not allowed to build projects that have retail components to them. They don't want mixed. You're in the housing business, you should just concentrate on the housing business, and that's all you should do. Because the Skid Row, the Housing Trust, has wanted to have a stronger connection to reinforce life on the street, they wanted to, again, take the very simple measure of putting retail space in the ground floor of the building, and they looked for a loophole, they found one. And the loophole says that if you buy a building that has retail in it, or if you have a building already that has retail in it, you can keep that retail going. So they did, in fact, buy a building, which was this one-story, very typical downtown Los Angeles building with parking on top, almost a sacrificial stucco exterior around the outside. Ground floor retail, which was filled with lots of small mom and pop type of retail shops. This building is a little bit on the edge of the garment district, and so some of these shops serve the garment district. Because of the need to keep this, keep that retail in a sense going, to fit within those regulations from the housing department, we needed to reuse this building, and you can sort of see it here in this rendering of the project. We did in fact reuse the existing building as the ground floor of the new building. That was complicated. It created a number of technical challenges for the building. But this building was in many ways ambitious for the trust at a number of levels, and one of those was at this level not only of doing mixed use, but also to begin to talk about a larger question of urban sustainability. And in Los Angeles, this would have been a kind of building that would have been, for the most part, torn down, scraped clean, and you would have built a completely new building on top of it a few years ago. The idea of reusing existing fabric, even existing fabric that seems as incidental as this building, was a big part of the overall conversation of the building. The second issue that we were starting to take on was this question of density, and what density might look like in a city like Los Angeles, where there really aren't very new models of density. What I was trying to do in this project was to create almost a kind of hyperdensity within the block. You can begin to see that each of these small towers ring around the courtyard, and there's an additional tower within it, which makes the spaces between the buildings much smaller, much more intimate. You again ring around and walk to your apartments in that single loaded corridor, same type of diagram all the way down through the building. But here, as opposed to that central courtyard, you're really in the thick of a dense new type of urban fabric. Because of that pressure of density and the lack of more traditional courtyard at the center of the building, instead we started to take that social space and flatten it out into a pancake of different activities on the second floor of that existing building that used to be the parking lot. In this case, transforming it into an amalgam of different community activities. That includes community kitchen, exercise room, recreation room, art class room, social services offices, as well as a number of outside spaces like half-court basketball, jogging track around the entire perimeter, community garden, yoga, outdoor classroom. That mix of different activities on that second floor of space, which seems to extend out into this low horizontal district of the city, and into what I think you could even begin to say is that larger continuous horizontal sprawl of the city was not only a way of organizing these individual community activities, but starting to see if you could pack them together into a new type of social diagram. In some ways, a kind of microcosm of social activities that started to represent a new dynamic, a new social public dynamic in a singular building. Because the building was being built on top of another building, and because the site was very difficult to build on top of, we looked at a method of construction that has never really been used in Los Angeles, multifamily prefabrication. There's one other building from the 1960s, about 50 years ago, that used some prefabrication. There's reasons, very arcane code reasons, why prefabrication hasn't been a possibility in Los Angeles. I'm not going to get into. But here, we saw it as a huge attribute on a very small site, and to stage the construction quickly. All of the units, 106 units, were built in Boise, Idaho. And you can see them coming from Boise here, eventually arriving in Los Angeles. They were built in Boise because we needed to build this building as a wood frame construction to fit within certain codes. In Boise, they do that very, very well. Stacking all of the units, once this concrete tray, which was poured and built over that existing building and over that new public or semi-public recreation deck, all of these units were then lifted into place in about 4 weeks. The units are all very much the same, very utilitarian, but for this community, the fact of having literally a kitchen or their own bathroom space are huge changes in their life. The building, which you can see here, the ground floor retail is starting to fill in. Its life on the street is very much starting to become an active one. That second layer is starting to become a very active part of the community within the building, and the apartments have all been occupied for a number of months now very successfully. This building and its relationship, I think, to the city is, for me, one idea about creating a more complex amalgam of parts to begin to represent and start to experiment with how architecture can be, in a sense, almost an urbanism in and of itself. But the scale of this project is still very much at the scale of a single building. We recently completed a building which starts to take many of these same questions and challenges those questions more at the scale of the city itself. One Santa Fe is a mixed-use project, in this case a private development, for-profit development, developer development. 440 units of housing. The entire ground floor is retail, about 75,000 square feet. A great deal of parking as well. In an area of the city not so far from Star Apartments and Skid Row and downtown, but in a very different condition, not so much in the middle of the city, but much more at the threshold or on a threshold of the city as it develops. This whole neighborhood is called the Arts District. It's a warehouse district that contains slightly larger buildings, loft-like buildings that much of the creative community in Los Angeles has lived in over the years. It is immediately adjacent to the Los Angeles River, which is undergoing or about to undergo a sequential significant revitalization in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers. It's just across the river from East LA, which is the heart of the Latino community in Los Angeles, which is now the majority community, very powerful politically in the city. As an aside, right next to SciArc, another architecture school, which is a long, skinny building. The site that we were given is just an image to give you a sense of the scale, and also to just reinforce the fact I've always wanted to do a skyscraper, but I've never gotten a chance. So if you tip it up on its side, it's, I think, the 7th tallest building in the world. This site is really marked by the fact that infrastructure has been the thing that has created the grain, the scale, the image of the city. SciArc, which is here, which was formerly the longest building, I think, in the city, is an old rail depot from the Union Pacific lines that ran through this part of the city. There's still an incredible number of rail lines, including the MTA lines, Amtrak, Union Pacific, being amongst the different rail companies that run through this part of the city, as well as the 1st Street Bridge to East LA and the 4th Street Bridge. That sense of the long and linear structure to the city certainly gave rise to some of the form of the building. But much of it came from just the fact of the unusual configuration of the building, a little bit wider to the south, and then very, very thin up against this maintenance building which needed to remain as an adjacent neighbor. The building is the diagram of the building, the planning strategy is very much as a layered or sandwich-like vertical disposition of the different programmatic layouts. At the ground floor, as I mentioned, it's almost all mixed-use retail that stretches from the First Street Bridge on. On the second level, on the northern part of the site, because we couldn't build the parking underneath, adjacent to that existing maintenance building, there are two layers of parking that get sandwiched in between, so they float up above and are accessed by these large spiral ramps, which start to create markers as you come down either First or Third Street. And then housing up above, either 5 levels to the south or 3 levels up above the parking. One of my thoughts in this project, which came in many ways from the previous project, Star Apartments, was that in developing densely in the city, that there are many ways of going about it. Certainly you can build up in that skyscraper or tall building scenario. But maybe there's also a way of starting to think of the city when it's a more horizontal city, of building over that lower grain, in a sense creating a kind of palimpsest or additional layering that starts to tie the city together in a very different way. And while we're not literally connected or on top of SCI-Arc, I think this image starts to give you the sense that that layering of a new structure, a new building on top of an existing building might create a way of not always having to remake the city, tearing the city down and remaking it, but to find ways for new structures in a city like Los Angeles to begin to both challenge the scale of the existing city, but to also use some of the phenomenal energy in the existing scale as well. I like this image because it gives you a very different sense of the building as it stacks up from west to east with the grain of the different scales of neighborhoods, moving from larger industrial buildings all the way to single-family houses in Boyle Heights in East LA. But as you look back to the building from the other direction, across the river, across the rail lines, across the power lines, it has a very different, almost industrial quality as well, and its full length starts to become much more apparent. At the ground level, at the street level, you can see the parking above. There's just a sense of the retail here. Much of the retail in these photographs is just getting built out. The building is, as I mentioned, just being completed, ground floor all the way down the street, SCI-Arc on the right-hand side, and then the apartments that slice over the top of it. There is an important portal where the building turns not so much building that hits the ground, but into more of a bridge that creates an opening from the street into these internal courtyards, where the scale of the building starts to change to a more meandering movement transversely down through the building. Again, where the ground floor retail takes place, you can see out to SCI-Arc. SCI-Arc, in a sense, almost completes the urban wall of this interior space. And then a parking lot at the ground floor, which is a flexible parking lot. At times, parking can also be used as a central plaza for the complex. It's another view of how the scale of the building begins to change or break down into a finer grain, including through these balconies and passages to the surrounding neighborhood. Maybe, while the scale of the building at the city, I think is certainly at a visual level one of the most insistent things about the building. But maybe one of the most important things about the building is the diversity of apartment types and scales of apartments that it sets up. We were trying in this building to create as much diversity to the community that would live there as possible. And there's many ways of doing that, certainly economically. There's been a conversation about how you integrate affordable housing into apartments. Here we were literally trying to do it with the scale of apartments themselves. Everything from smaller micro studios to very large 4-bedroom units with 2 and 3 and 1-bedroom units in between. And that range, that diversity of different units, while unusual in a typical developer building, has allowed for individuals, groups of individuals, students, to find inventive ways of starting to create relationships to rent these apartments, including some of these 4-bedroom units where 8 people have gotten together to live in them. There are some units in the bridge which are more of a skip-stop configuration, similar to the Unité units, Corbusier's Unité units, where there's one corridor down the middle, and then you come in and either have a 1.5-story unit up above or 1.5-story down below. The advantage of these units is that you're able to see through both sides of that bridge from downtown all the way to East Los Angeles. That bridge, as I mentioned, creates a very strong gateway into the middle of the building. But our ambitions here were not to stop in the middle of the development. The ambitions of this building as more of a threshold building, as a kind of gateway to that emerging development of the river and potentially connecting all the way to East LA at some point, was very much on my mind as we were beginning this project. We have started, or we developed a conceptual set of bridges which at the time seemed preposterous all the way to the river, but now with the development of the river is starting to be revisited. And here's a point that for me is very key to this project, and that's a question of anticipation. We've been criticized at some level, not too much in this project. It's been received very well in general, but there has been some criticism that the project is too big in this part of the city, and I understand that criticism. At the same time, much of what we were trying to do in this project was to create a kind of anticipatory scale, a scale of the building that was not trying to meet the city where it is today, because in a city that is developing as rapidly as Los Angeles, to meet the city today means likely that tomorrow you've missed the change in the city. But in fact, to meet the scale of the city in 10 or 20 or even 25 years, which is, I think, a responsibility in architecture to not only plan for how a building is going to relate to a particular context now, but to understand architecture, especially in the city, as a component of master planning for the long term. That architecture will, over the course of its life, a building of this type over the course of its life, have a changing set of relationships as the city builds around it. And even all of these projects that I was mentioning, whether it's Carver Apartments, Rainbow Apartments, all of these little dots, are and a bridge project that we're doing, that over time, beginning to understand them not as individual projects, but almost a web of relationships that build up over time, is quite interesting in thinking about larger planning in the city. People believe, I think often, that projects like the Staples Center or Convention Center are going to, because of their large gravitational scale, they're going to save the city. They're going to change the city for the positive just because of their bigness, that they have so much influence in the city that they will change it ultimately for the better over time. And maybe that's true, but just as often those projects miss the way that the city is developing. What I've really begun to think is not only the scale of the type of development as one Santa Fe is important, but really these types of webs of relationships and the scale of a project that is based on the accumulation, the iterative or temporal accumulation of all of the parts, has just as large, if not an even more beneficial role in the city. We're working on a project that takes some of these same ideas and begins to visit them in a single building, but in a very different context. And that's a project called the Moody Center at Rice University in Houston. The Moody Center is going here on the edge of what is the more traditional campus of Rice University, at a gateway into the campus, which is increasingly becoming one of the major gateways into the city as the development of the campus starts to move more in this direction. The Moody Center is a new type of program for the university. It's not one department that will run this center, but is meant to be a building that is truly an interdisciplinary building. Rice University believes in this building that there is great possibility, great promise in starting to take many different disciplines from around campus and outside of campus in the city of Houston as a whole, other different institutions like the Museum of Fine Arts, some of the other universities, and create a building in which they're starting to curate these different groups, to give them space to make projects over the course of a semester, even shorter, over the course of a couple of weeks or over the course of a year. So this building is, in a sense, taking the energy from many different intellectual centers and trying to bring it together into one equivalent to the campus as a whole. We took that idea and started to imagine, again, almost fantasize that all of the buildings of Rice, if you collapse them, if you started to squish the public space and the quadrangles and the open courtyards together, that you could begin to think about the engineering department and the art department and the international studies department, and clip that out, that would almost become the building in and of itself. Rice is marked by these long, linear, bar-like buildings, and so the building that we're designing, the Moody Center, starts to become a series of these longer, linear forms that relate in scale to the existing buildings at Rice. And here, diagrammatically, you can begin to maybe get a sense of that. But there's something also important, that is that the campus of Rice flows to this part of the building, and I started to think of whether almost the ground plane, that landscape of the university, could slide under all of these buildings, starting to create a relationship vertically as well as horizontally, and that ground floor, these different intellectual centers, could be something that was both transited, as if the campus had a very open, porous relationship to the building, as well as being denser, floating up above the building. We started with literally just a series of collage diagrams that started to show some of these historic photographs of the type of learning and engineering space with the campus, which is almost all these oak trees, very dense up above, and then very open and visible down below. The building is quite literally the equivalent of that, a denser building up above with a completely transparent ground floor down at the ground floor of the campus. One of the requirements in this building, the entire campus is brick, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, which is the first brick building that we've ever done. So there's a very strong separation in a sense of this heavy, dense brick series of forms up above the lightness of the ground floor. This is the axiometric of the ground floor. Starts to give you some sense of the very different types of program. Gallery, which is a joint gallery run with the Museum of Fine Arts in the city. Flexible student-run gallery. Larger studio spaces. 99-seat black box theater with some of its back of house spaces. This entire wing of the building, all glass, are more traditional shops as well as digital shops. Everything from woodworking, sewing, metallurgy, as well as three-dimensional digital fabrication. As you move up into the building, some of these spaces are quite tall, double height, triple height spaces, and then smaller, more intimate classrooms, office spaces, with some medium-sized office spaces up above. If you peeled away the outer skin, the inside of the building is almost a three-dimensional topography of different type of open and closed learning spaces. As I mentioned, large studios, flexible gallery, and connections up above. In this case, large stair, which can be used as a teaching classroom in and of itself. It's an interior view of that space. Range and different feeling of the interior spaces of the classrooms. I mentioned that the building was required to be a brick building. Most of the brick on the Rice campus is in that color, but because we're a little bit off of the main quad, there was a lot more flexibility that we were given in this project. And I got very interested in making a building that was incredibly luminous on the inside and almost like a series of galleries, white boxes, white cubes on the inside, within this darker shroud on the exterior. The brick that we're using is this magnesium alloy brick, which has a sheen to it that changes significantly over the course of the day. It goes from very blue color to slightly more warm color over the course of the day, depending on what the sky is like. And then a very deeply raked pink grout back from the facade. What that does is that from certain directions of the building, as you come on it obliquely, the building, I think the brick will appear to be very much an intense and dark solid. But as you move around it and start to see the grout, that color, that warmer color against the cooler color of the grout starts to become much more visible. And so that heavy form has a real dynamic to it, a real almost choreography to it as you move around it on the campus. And you see the building, how it floats above, and the more luminous quality of the inside starting to pour out onto the campus. There are moments of the brick which turn into screens, so that along walkways, arcades in the campus, you're halfway inside and halfway out of the building, and that heaviness of the brick starts to give way to a transparent, almost veil-like sense of that exterior skin. Campus and landscape is something increasingly interesting and part of our work. Maybe it grows out of an idea that in a city like Los Angeles, landscape is so much a part of the sense of urbanism. Certainly there's been, at a disciplinary level, a great mutual interest between landscape and architecture as ideas about things like landscape urbanism become more and more a part of the conversation, or have been a big part of the conversation in how we think about urbanism. We, a couple of years ago, completed a park in an area of the city called Playa Vista, which is this whole part of the city, which was undeveloped for the most part. It's the old Howard Hughes aircraft site where things like the Spruce Goose were developed. A lot of engineering work and aeronautic development, especially during the war and post-war, took place. It is, at least in the eastern portion of that site, has been developing over the past 5 or 10 years into more of a residential district, very much in a kind of new urbanist model. But there's a portion of the site at this end which is intended for more creative and media type of businesses. Google now has a presence here, Belkin has a presence here, and we are doing buildings at this corner, which we had received the day before the recession started, and then we lost the day after the recession started. But in between, we were asked to do the park at the center of the site. These buildings have now come back, and we're in development in them again. But the park has become now the context, whereas there was very little context, and when we started the project, the park in a funny way is now the thing that we're relating to with our own buildings. I'm interested in the idea of landscape, not so much in a classical way, a park to be experienced as an equivalent, for instance, to nature, as a more processional equivalent to, or an alter ego to the city, but maybe more in a city like Los Angeles or in any contemporary city, an idea about trying to create almost an equivalent, not the same, but a kind of equivalent to the city and the park, as if you did take a series of these different experiences and activities and put them together into a type of bento box of experiences. These are images that the architectural photographer Iwan Bond took for a book that I did called No More Play, which in many ways I think start to create a real idea of visual equivalent to those multiple types of landscapes and activities that exist in a place like Los Angeles. The buildings I mentioned that we're doing are out here. This whole site, which looks like the desert, is now almost all filled in. And the park is organized as a series of bridges, activity bridges that connect the two sides of this campus. Each one of them having a very different activity, as I mentioned: horticultural bridge, large amphitheater bridge, basketball, beach volleyball, children's playground, lawn sports bridge. These are the horticultural gardens, which are a place that you can just meander through, but are also a place where horticultural classes take place. Shade sports bridge, where there's everything from bocce and horseshoes and just quiet sitting. Increasingly a place where small meetings take place outside of the buildings, so that it becomes an extension of what happens inside the buildings. And each of these different activities, again, like basketball or beach volleyball, have lives that are very much extensions of the kind of 24/7 life that occurs inside of these creative industry buildings, which I think is increasingly the way that lives are manifest in the blurring of work and living. And if anybody in architecture knows exactly what that means, that your life inside the studio and your life outside the studio are very much intertwined. Here we were trying to make a space that was, again, not separate from the life inside these buildings, but was almost a way of seeing the park as an extension of those activities. Bandshell is maybe the singular, the equivalent, the most equivalent structure to what we normally think of as architecture. And the bandshell is meant to be a place for performance, even impromptu performance, but it's also very much a meeting place in the park. It's structured as a three-dimensional space frame connected only at the very base, as if it's like a clamshell that's opened up. It's a fabric structure that at night lights up, and that fabric skin over the three-dimensional frame of the form underneath gives you a very different sense of the building as it moves from solid to more animate form, where the skeleton of the inside starts to become, in a way, the most important characteristic of the building. I like this image because it not only gives you a sense of the inside of the shell, but when this space starts to fill up with audience, it starts to connect almost to the balcony of houses up above, which are the more typical traditional urban condition in Los Angeles of all of those single-family houses. And here you can almost begin to maybe again fantasize the connection between civic space and private space. I want to finish with two projects where the scale of some of these ideas between landscape planning, architecture, and the city expand. First of them is a project in St. Petersburg, Florida, called the St. Petersburg Pier. It was a project, a competition that we won to replace the existing pier on this site. And the existing pier is very much an existing type of pier, where kind of lollipop of experience. You come out, see the water, and then go back the same exact way. Very discrete and separate. Instead, what we proposed was a pier that began to unfold in this figure 8 of movement that then would connect to other parks in the city. And as opposed to architecture being the object at the end, instead the water, which is the most quintessential characteristic of St. Petersburg, being the thing at the center. And here you begin to just get a sense of that diagram as these different loops expanded all the way back to a central lake at the center of the city. This project is very important for me and for, I think, the thinking in the office. It's also one of the most difficult projects to talk about because this project died, and died very forcefully. And it's one of the complex stories, I think, that we're doing or having ambition of doing this kind of work in the public or political realm, where the conversation about the project is no longer between a singular client and the architect, but in a sense is a much larger conversation within a context like the city of St. Petersburg, where it's almost more the context for a conversation between the citizens and the government of the city itself. And that conversation became very contentious, with the pier becoming really the flashpoint, the illustration of a great deal of concern about the way that the city was changing from an older version of the city to a new and very different, dynamically very different type of city. And the project ended up going to referendum, which was really a referendum about the city government, but was unfortunately worded to say that if you voted no, you were voting to cancel Michael Maltzan. Not the contract with Michael Maltzan, or not the contract with Michael Maltzan Architecture, but to literally cancel Michael Maltzan, I guess, himself. And the project was voted down in that referendum. I'm still around, so somehow I got out of that. But the extraordinary thing, in a sense, was to understand or to see firsthand a dynamic in which a project that was so much about creating a space, quite literally, for the conversation to take place about the city, becoming the thing that was the illustration, not only of that conversation, but well, for the project, the negative side of that conversation. Still in all, many of the ideas of this project, of a project in which architecture both attempts to become iconic in and of itself, stand for something, be very identifiable, but to make space be the primary thing, to make something as ineffable as the changing quality of the water be very much the center of the city, is a very compelling one for me. Here, that had a number of different activities. There was a small beach, or a small watercraft pier, the lagoon, which was a teaching space, with docents at the center of this space. The canopy getting quite large as you went out to the very end of the pier, that created shade and protection for a restaurant, a gelato shop, and fishing pier. You could also not just transit around the shell, but bicyclists, rollerbladers, joggers could come up onto that shell, so that quite literally the surface became occupiable and active as well. I mentioned this is the social part of the city, and is also the obligatory fireworks shot for that kind of space. But it does start to reinforce, I think, the scale of this type of space, where this type of activity could take place and become that place of not only daily life, but celebration for the city. Up on the canopy, you had views back to the city, the dock space, some of these teaching spaces. When the tide went out, there were loops that allowed you to go out to the remnants of the old pier, where there was coral and wildlife that would take place. As you approach the pier from the outside, the activities that I was describing, restaurant, ice cream shop, down below in a more of a jetty, the ramp that came through this large opening with views to the inside and outside of the pier, and then these smaller balconies. And while the idea of the pier was for this larger collective space, there were also moments where smaller groups, whether it was a family or an individual, could come out to these balconies and have a more one-to-one or intimate relationship to the horizon of that waterscape. The thinking about that project has been very consequential for the last project I want to show tonight, which is a project which is just about to start in construction, which is the new 6th Street Bridge Viaduct in Los Angeles. This is an older picture. You can see City Hall and the river before it was channelized, running underneath. In this case, the 6th Street Bridge is the 4th Street Bridge, and the 1st Street Bridge, one Santa Fe. That long building I was mentioning would be right over here. This is taken from the east side, looking back to what is now downtown in the city. The river, before it was channelized post-war, would flood, and there's a very wide basin that would create, and that's why this bridge is raised and is in essence a viaduct. The crossing of the river is only at this one point. And that existing bridge at that crossing has these two very iconic arches, which many people in the city and outside the city know, because this bridge has shown up in so many films, music videos, television commercials, especially car commercials. It is, though, often stood in as a kind of set piece for a deeply dystopic and troubled and urban and rough, gritty part of the city. Though because it has such a strong visual connection to what people think of as Los Angeles, one of the briefs of the project was to make the new bridge an iconic bridge, which is difficult to contemplate in thinking about how you actually create an icon day one, most times that happens to some kind of a structure over time. The bridge needs to be taken down. The old bridge needs to be taken down because it was built with a concrete that was using all of its aggregate from the river, and over time that aggregate has had a very problematic, degrading effect on the reinforcing and the concrete itself. There's no saving the bridge. What we started to think about in this bridge, what I was interested in was certainly making a connection to the existing bridge, and in this case quite literally through those arches, but to expand that, to create a kind of ribbon of arches from one side of the city to the other. In a sense, starting to say that the crossing was no longer important, but what was important was the knitting together, or the continuation of one side of the city to another, to start to work against the silozation or the separatization, separating effect that infrastructure often has in the city, and to use infrastructure here to move from, as I mentioned before, that idea of a monoculture to something that is more of a multiculture, that takes on multiple responsibilities, tying the city together. The bridge has a primary job, which is still to get cars from one side of the city to another, but also to get now pedestrians, bicyclists, from one side of the city to another. And also in our project, to use many of the spaces that in the past the viaduct wasn't so concerned with because it was the floodplain of the river, to start to use those as larger public amenities. Here is a new plaza on the Arts District side, which is already being programmed by a nonprofit to become very much a large hall, a civic and social hall within the city, to reinforce the restoration of the river by creating stronger access and visual promontories that you can see the river from, to give you a sense that the river is actually there. To take much of the land which is being, will become extra property from the construction of the bridge, and to turn that into a larger park, primarily for the east side, and to make that park more and more accessible by additional structures, bike ramps, accessibility ramps, and also these stairways up and over the arches. And in that sense, this project and its attempt to take something as clear as a structural engineering project and start to produce greater complexity to that project, to make something as direct as the structuring of the bridge take on other responsibilities, to create connections not only horizontally from one side of the city, but also vertically, to begin to stack the different sectional activities in and around the site and be able to collapse them or tie them together is a completely new type of responsibility, I think, for this type of structure in the city. But I think it goes potentially even beyond that. And in a very simple moment in the bridge where the stairways come up and in a few places come up and over the arch, I think you can we're beginning to make the connection to what it means to make an icon in the city. I think when most people say icon, they think something visually very strong that you can see, you can take a picture of, that appears on postcards in cities. And you can, when we first started this project, I thought about those structures like the St. Louis Arch, or the Eiffel Tower, or the Statue of Liberty. And each and every one of those projects is very different architecture stylistically, some modern, some not. But each and every one of them are structures that stand in for the cities in which they're located. But if you look deeper, you realize that each and every one of them is actually an observatory, that there are places to go up to, and to look out and see the city as much as to be seen. And in that way, for me, this bridge is deeply important, that it's not only a thing to see, and hopefully it is a very strong physical presence in the landscape, but it's also a structure that allows you to literally and maybe even to begin to, in a more insinuating way, give you a place to see the city now, and to begin to speculate about the future of that city, to collapse some of what is happening physically on the site, to make that more accessible, but to also begin to collapse the past, the present, and the future of the city, and to hopefully make that more visible and accessible as well. Thank you. I appreciate it. I will take it, absolutely, absolutely. If there are any.
We will now take questions from the audience.
I wanted to probe and ask a little bit. I think in the intro to your book, you talk about growing up in Levittown, and I wanted to know how sort of the economic planner service of those structures and sort of how that leads into the ranch house construction in LA, how that's affected your work, or if you feel it's affected your work at all. And then I wanted you to talk a little bit about color, which is very prominent in Los Angeles architects, especially with plans of you and Michael sort of work together at the same time, and you both. I don't want to say you use color in the same way, but in similar ways. So just if you could talk to this.
Well, to the first question, I grew up in a post-war suburb, and one, I think I understand those places. When I first moved to Los Angeles, it felt very familiar. I felt like, contrary to a lot of people's experience, I felt like it was a place that I knew very well. And at first I thought it was because I grew up watching a lot of TV, and all the TV was filmed in Los Angeles. What I realized was, in fact, that Los Angeles is in many ways a post-war suburb as well, or much of the city is the result of that model. I grew up with an appreciation of that kind of place. For me, it wasn't. It didn't have the same stigma that many people associate with the suburbs. It was a place where there was a real community. There was a great deal of activity, that we used the open spaces intensely, and we made up ideas about those open spaces. The small space between houses for us was not an indication of the homogeneity of those places, but it was more a place where you could make up a world. So I think when I came to Los Angeles, as well as when I see a lot of those suburbs, I actually read a lot of possibility into those places. I think it's important not to automatically dismiss the ideas that come from those places. In Los Angeles, I think it's given me a very different sense of how to deal with scale, how to deal with repetition, and maybe even more importantly, to give me a very different idea about what I learned context to be when I was in school. When I was in school, especially when I was in school, when Hashim was in school, it was very much at a moment where modernism had been, there had been a great deal of question about the trajectory of modernism. Postmodernism had had a strong imprint on education. I was really questioning of what modernism had produced, and a kind of classical or more traditional idea about the city was a big part of the conversation. I think we questioned that a great deal, and one of the things that came out of that was this idea about context being used in too simple a way, that if you made the cornices all line up, and if you made the windows be the same, that somehow you were being a contextual architect. Moving to a place like Los Angeles, it's very difficult to imagine how you do that, because context isn't so apparent. It's difficult to replicate something in a city that's as heterogeneous as a place like Los Angeles. It started to make me think that you needed to evolve the idea of context to a more complex and nuanced understanding of the city. And I began to be much more interested in the idea of the characteristics of a place. I was trying to imagine if you could begin to identify them, if almost you could begin to analyze those in some concrete way, and begin to extend those characteristics as a way of not replicating other more traditional models, but finding value in the openness of a place like Los Angeles, and trying to find a way as an architect to extend that. That might even relate a little bit to your question about color. I'm surprised about the question of color, frankly, because most times the question that I get as it relates to color is, why are your buildings all white? It's in a way about the anti-color. I actually think that I am very interested in color. And even in the whiteness of many of my buildings, I often think that I'm thinking about color, or maybe not color so much as the fact that I think of color as a material. I don't think of color in the way that most people think of it as color. It for me, very often gets used in the same way that, or similar way to the way that architects use materials to create differences and separations in form and space. But if you dig a little bit even deeper, as it relates to something like the idea of characteristics of place, or the idea of the whiteness in the buildings, I started to become, I'm suspicious of materials as an architect. And that's largely because I think architecture has too often given itself a pass. It's made itself easy on itself by using materials in a way that they stand in for something. They stand in for the quality of a building by using particular materials, or they stand in for the contemporariness of a building by using certain materials. I began to believe that that often felt the buildings, their impact didn't necessarily last. It wasn't as strong. It was more fleeting. And I was pushing myself, I was challenging myself to try to make buildings that in a sense were anti-material buildings, that had just as forceful of an effect, just as sculptural of an effect, not only in the forms but in the spaces, but without using what I was thinking was the crutch of materials. What came of that was, for me, the idea that, or the reality that, very often that neutral canvas took on many of the characteristics of the place, whether it was the color over the course of the day or the intense grittiness of the place. And I started to use different textures to, for instance, plaster in Los Angeles to exaggerate that. And that, I think, has informed a lot of my thinking about the qualities of color as they relate to those characteristics. As an aside, just one more piece of that that was influential earlier on, at least the way that I approach color. We did a project a number of years ago, earlier, when the office was a few years old, for a Museum of Modern Art called MoMA Queens, which was to take, when they were building the Taniguchi building in Manhattan, it was to take an old building, a swingline stapler factory in Queens, which is outside of Manhattan, in Long Island City, and to turn that into a temporary space for MoMA exhibition space while they built the new building. And the existing swingline building was a light blue, almost robin's egg brick building. For curatorial reasons, for climatic reasons, the building was too leaky. There are major pieces of work inside the museum. We needed to reclad the building in this, stuck with this EFIS system on the exterior. But everybody knew that building as the blue building. It had an enormous cultural imprint in the city as a whole. If you came in from JFK, you knew the blue building. And I wanted to extend, or at least connect to some of that cultural history. So we made the building, we colored the building on the top blue. Again, it was more juiced in. It was a more contemporary blue, but it was blue nonetheless. We picked the blue. We picked 3 blue colors that I thought were in the family, the right blue colors. We sent them to New York, and they painted these large 10-foot by 10-foot panels on the side of the building. And I flew to New York to see them and to work with everybody to pick what was the right blue. I was very excited. I got off the plane at JFK. I got in the car, and we drove immediately to Long Island City. And I got out, and it was the building. And there were the 3 panels of blue, and all 3 of the blues were completely wrong. They were absolutely the wrong colors. And I realized that they were wrong because I picked those colors in a Los Angeles light, and those colors were living now in a very different, in a Long Island City, in East Coast light. And it was a very instant, very hard, very direct lesson that the characteristics of place, that the nuances of different places are very real. And that at that point I started to believe that it's not that brick signifies building in one place or another, or one material signifies your relationship to context. But these other, in some ways, more nuanced, more abstract characteristics are even more defining of the architecture and its relationship to those particular places. And that, I think, has influenced directly both my fascination in things like color, but in our constant questioning of how to approach that question. That was a really long answer to one question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.